Well, it's just about that time for another episode of Ask Boston Sax, the show where I take your questions about saxophone and really anything else and actually answer them. Later on, we'll have special guest Jeff Goldblum giving us some fresh fashion tips for the season. Hey Jack, do you think there's any risk to having a horn that doesn't have any lacquer on it? So having a bare brass saxophone has definitely become in vogue over, I would say, the last decade, just because so many vintage horns at this point, the lacquer has worn off. Now, the original lacquering process for a vintage saxophone, let's say, up until probably like the 1980s, was to use a substance called nitrocellulose lacquer, which is very thin. It was never even intended to be a permanent finish. In fact, a lot of vintage horns will actually have the warranty card that we've gotten here at the shop that say lacquer is not intended to be permanent, which is why so many of them got refinished over time. But that being said, it does wear off very easily, which is, just developed this kind of cool culture for having a horn that looks like it's aged, even if it's not. Now, the only downside to having a bare brass saxophone is just if aesthetically it bothers you, that it will change. It's going to patina and react to your saliva, the acidity in your sweat on your hands when you're playing, which I think is really cool because no two bare brass saxophones will ever look the same. It becomes very personal. But if it's going to bug you that it will potentially change over time, then it's probably not the right finish for you. Hey Jack, what's the difference between a jazz and a classical saxophone reed? So overall, if you look at the general sound profile that most classical saxophone players are going for, it's very dark, very consistent, very homogeneous, no buzz, no edge, which I think are a lot of the things that we typically associate with a jazz sound. So in order to achieve that, most classical saxophone reeds are just overall thicker, usually in the heart profile. The most famous classical saxophone reed of all time is the Van Doren Blue Box, which actually has a very thin tip profile, but a very, very thick heart, which again gives it that darkness, that warmth, but of course makes it a little bit more difficult to project and get that buzz and edge that a lot of jazz players like. Overall, the two biggest factors in reed design are the thickness of the heart and the thickness of the tip, and balancing those out can really change the sound profile depending on whether you want a jazz sound or a more classical sound. Hey Boston Sax, will playing a lot of fast and technical stuff a lot on the saxophone end up wearing out the keys faster? Well, I really like that you're even concerned about wearing out the keys on your saxophone because most people aren't. Again, saxophone keys are made out of brass. The things that hold them on the damn horn are made out of steel. Steel's a lot harder than brass. Put those two together, rub them a lot, you're going to get wear and tear. The things that prevent that from happening are the oil and grease that are inside the keywork of your horn, which I do recommend having changed every year or so, just like changing the oil in your car. Now, if you're playing a lot of fast stuff, you're playing a lot of technical stuff, I guess from an objective point of view, you are moving the keys more often, increasing the wear, but I certainly wouldn't change the way you're playing out of concern for that. I would just be more aware of the regular routine and preventative maintenance on your saxophone, which it sounds like you're already doing, so bully for you. Hey Jack, I noticed in the first episode of Ask Boston Sax, you mentioned that the finishes on saxophones don't make a difference in the sound. I was curious why many of the Boston Sax Shop products are double plated. Well, first off, thank you so much for watching, and we'll definitely drop a link to the first episode below if you haven't had a chance to check it out. So a lot of the plated products that we make here at Boston Sax Shop, whether it's silver or gold plated, we like to do double plating simply for durability. You have to remember that when you electroplate something with a precious metal, it's a very, very thin layer, and just for longevity, we do it twice just so it lasts a little bit longer. Hey Boston Sax Shop, I've bought a lot of different kinds of reeds and some of them tend to mold and some of them don't. Why would that happen? Well, sorry to be a dick, but you can't actually blame the reeds in this case. Saxophone reeds, how they're made, the cane has literally nothing to do with whether or not they will develop mold or not. Mold happens because of humidity, and that has to do with how you're storing the reeds and the environment that you're potentially playing them in. So you've got to make sure that your reeds dry out to a certain degree and can breathe. This means using a reed case that has the ability to vent. You might need to add some rock salt or some kind of desiccant in order to absorb moisture if you're in a really humid environment. And make sure that if you're worried about mold problems or humidity, that you're not locking your reeds in your case as soon as you're done. Most saxophone cases are not airtight, but they are tight enough that they're not going to allow for airflow and the reeds to dry out. So if you're worried about it, make sure that you're leaving the reeds on something that's going to allow them to dry flat, but have enough airflow so that they don't become moldy, waterlogged, and overly humid.
Jack, man, I gotta ask you, how do you know so much?
Are we rolling right now? Yeah, I just make it up. It's complete bullshit. No, seriously. Well, I'm lucky that I've been able to approach this from a couple different perspectives. I have a master's degree in saxophone performance, so I like to think that at one point I really knew how to play the saxophone pretty well. I started the shop as a repair shop, so I've learned the intricacies of how the instrument works from a mechanical level and really been able to diagnose how changing one individual factor will actually affect things. You know, that's something I've always been really interested in, is being able to step away, be objective, and really answer the questions that are hard to answer. Like, you know, does the finish make a difference? And in order to do that, set up little experiments for myself, like take two horns that are exactly the same but have different finishes and record them and see, is there actually a noticeable difference between the two things? And I'm fortunate that having the shop has allowed me to have that perspective. And that has continued on to designing the saxophone products that we now sell at Boston Sax Shop, which are reeds, necks, mouthpieces. And again, I've continued sort of that pursuit of objectivity and, you know, I guess, if you will, a sort of scientific approach to being able to do stuff that not everybody gets to do. Like take a mouthpiece and have them be exactly the same in every single regard, except one of them has 5% more baffle than the other, to see what that does. Change the facing curve, but nothing else, to see what that does. Take a batch of reeds, one has, you know, a tip profile that's ever so slightly thicker, and really be able to isolate those factors, which allows me to develop a lexicon of knowledge that I can apply to developing new products and also to be able to hopefully kind of answer your questions.